In strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNewsGlobal. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and you're watching our weekly flagship show, The Talking Point. A warm welcome to all our viewers who are joining us live, and a welcome to those viewers who will pick up this stream later on our YouTube channel. We're also welcoming from London Dr. Sam Geall. He's the CEO of the China Dialogue Trust. He's an associate fellow at the Environment and Society program at Chatham House, associate faculty at the Science Policy Research Unit. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Geall.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, Amitabh.
Pleasure is ours. And joining us at the crack of dawn in Victoria and British Columbia in Canada is Dr. Sandeep Pai. He's a senior researcher at the Energy Security and Climate Change program at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and is the co-author of a book called Total Transition, The Human Side of the Renewable Energy Revolution. Thanks for giving us time so early in the morning, Dr. Pai.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm excited about this conversation.
Dr. Geall, just coming to you about COP26. I know there are a couple of days still left, but a lot of countries have been talking officially, and there has been some movement in that. The media and analysts have been calling it all sorts of things already. Of course, pun on the word "cop out" is one of the headlines in one of the publications. But on a more serious note, where do you see it heading, even though it hasn't started, in terms of the indications that we've got, Dr. Geall?
I think I'd go to the famous Antonio Gramsci adage: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Clearly we're not quite clear enough yet in terms of where we need to get to. The United States is coming back in after a very damaging administration under President Trump that saw the United States withdraw from Paris. Geopolitical tensions are high, and it's impossible to see that not sort of casting a shadow over some of the talks. The COVID-19 pandemic has meant years of delays, postponements, and cancellations of the whole calendar of environmental negotiations. So there's a lot of really difficult things. Plus, the US hasn't been able to get climate legislation through Congress. China's got a new NDC out, and it's widely being judged to not be a step up in ambition. Similar charges are being leveled against the Indian offer and a number of the other kind of large pledges to the climate COP. And most importantly of all, in my opinion, we are still not seeing enough commitment from the rich countries in terms of solidarity on climate finance, on loss and damage, on vaccines, on debt. Restoring faith in the multilateral process, I think, is incredibly important. But having said all that, I'm optimistic that this is where we start. We are now going into the talks. Paris still was a monumental achievement. The United States is now recommitted to it. Let's sort of see where we can go. I'm not willing to kind of give up before it's even started.
Sure. Dr. Pai, your take, overall, and of course we've seen statements from the Indian government, with Environment Minister and other officials, talking about climate justice and how net zero is not a solution in itself. So what's the sense you get? There's again suspense because the Prime Minister is going to be present there, so we don't know really what is going to happen.
Absolutely. Like you said, Prime Minister is going to be there, so we don't know what the ultimate final announcement would be. But look, essentially India's stand is, they're articulating the common but differentiated responsibility. Once India signs on to a net zero deal, and if they were, and they've clearly articulated that, that's not something they're going to do, that is in a way, they will have to concede that, from now on, the emissions, the carbon budget of the future is something which is, split between every nation. If India also signs out to a 2050 net zero deal. So what India is saying is that we are not historically responsible for these emissions. So do not put us on the same pedestal as other countries, especially rich countries, to be meeting these net zero targets by 2050. So that is India's stand, and India basically is at the center of negotiations when it comes to the global South countries or developing countries. And this stand of India is a very important stand. I think not just for India, but it has implications for other emerging economies as well. Uh, I think the second big thing, which I get a sense of, is the issue of climate finance. I think India is going to go and talk a lot about climate finance and seek, the $100 billion committed and much beyond. African group of negotiators have already said that 100 billion is not enough. We want like more than $1 trillion every year. So India is going to put pressure on that stand, and that is again a very much an articulation of this common but differentiated responsibility. The last point I would just want to add is that the climate finance that India is asking for, this $100 billion, this is India is not going to personally benefit from any of this $100 billion, but this is very much a stand of climate justice and CBDR.
Sure. Dr. Gill, you mentioned it, but the points that Dr. Bai is raising as well in terms of the West, of the industrialized, the developed countries, you mentioned that they're not unified in how other developed countries unified in that manner in asking for what they want.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think there's clarity really on exactly what's being offered, but hopefully, that there is room for rich countries to come to the table with something that will help to restore faith in the process. I just think it's important to step back and think about what Glasgow is. It's not Copenhagen or Paris where there's a new treaty being agreed. It's the sort of coming together to try to restore faith and to get some momentum around the really critical points that bind together this treaty. Those being the mitigation ambition, particularly the 1.5 degree target, which I think is critical to keep on the table. The cash promises, this really sort of critical question around, which so much hangs, which is the finance. And also the kind of the rule book process, the getting some progress on the kind of rules and so on. It's boring stuff, but it is actually really important to make multilateralism work. So all of those things need to see some progress. And I think there is room. On the finance, I do think there's a few things, I guess, to think about. I mean, I do think it's important to restore faith, and I also think it's morally incumbent on rich countries to step up, particularly at a point after the devastation really that the COVID-19 pandemic has wreaked on a lot of developing world economies, where it's led to a fiscal crisis and a debt crisis in other countries. We really can't sort of shirk that responsibility. But as I think you're alluding to, that 100 billion doesn't really do anything in terms of actual transition. It's not what's going to address climate change. What's going to address climate change actually is the trillions. It's the money in the capital markets, and it's investment and so on. And that's a conversation that I hope also will start moving forward at COP26, which is much more around how you change the rules of global finance. And that's why these meetings need to happen, so that you can get some progress in those sectoral areas, and really sort of, once you get past some of the grandstanding, actually make some progress on those kinds of rules that can only really be decided in a multilateral sort of global fashion.
Your thoughts on that, Dr. Bai, in terms of, you mentioned that $100 billion, which is supposed to be ready by 2020. They're saying 2023 now. And like you mentioned, it's South Africa, various other countries who are talking about trillions. But Dr. Geall is also raising the issue of the markets and technology transfer, and which is much more than that fund alone.
Yeah, so I think Sam is absolutely spot on. So just to give you an example of what this 100 billion is in the Indian context, right? India needs funds in 4 areas. One is, mitigation, so deployment of clean energy, solar and wind, and others. Second is, if we really are talking about net zero targets, then India needs funds in terms of just transition, taking care of workers and communities who will be stranded. Three, India would need funds in terms of like loss and damage, right? We are seeing what's happening in Kerala, and like when you have such loss and damage, who would compensate? Fourth, India would need funds in terms of adaptation, so climate adaptation, like how do you build resilient cities and so on. So this $100 billion, even if India were to get like 4 or 5 billion out of 100 billion, it's not going to be enough, because research has shown that India needs trillions, every year in all these four areas taken together. So unless we mobilize finance, not just through a transfer from a rich country to a poor country, but in terms of capital markets, in terms of making business case for some of these new technologies, uh, there's no clear mitigation pathway for India to meet those targets.
Sure. Dr. Gill, like both of you are pointing out, it's not just that climate fund of $100 billion. But am I correct to say that the developing countries, or at least some of them, are raising the issue of, even within that fund, the fact that they are given that money, and do they have to pay interest on that? I mean, are they asking for grants instead of so-called assistance, which they have to pay for?
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be questions over exactly what form that finance takes, and preferably not in the form of loans. Yeah, that's true. But there's a wider conversation that is going to play out around the role of overseas development assistance, around the role of loans and big lenders. One of the big sort of fault lines was always likely to be the role of China as an overseas financier of fossil fuels. Xi Jinping, to his credit, at the UN General Assembly in September, has already sort of set out his stall on that, which is to say China is stopping its finance for coal-fired power overseas, which I think is it's a good signal, and a signal that this sort of overseas finance is going to shift towards green energy. And as Dr. Pai rightly said, that's it's a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. If you take seriously the pledges that countries have put forward in their NDCs and their pledges to the Climate Convention, and actually look at the scale of infrastructure build that will require, that's trillions upon trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure. And we're then at an inflection point in global development, and there is an enormous need for that investment. And the kinds of conversations, actually the type of competition that I'd like to see really play out over the next several years, will be between, who gets to finance that and build that, because it's an enormous opportunity, particularly for emerging economies like China and India.
Sure. We were just playing out some of your recent work, Dr. Geall, as well. I mean, the standard narrative is that China is not going to be there. I mean, Xi Jinping is not going to be there. We don't know whether he might address it virtually or not. But as you have pointed out in your recent work, I mean, everybody who matters on the Chinese side will be, and him not being there doesn't really matter. Is that my correct assessment of your work?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think, firstly, Xi Jinping not attending is not a snub to COP26 specifically. He's not attended any. He's not been on any foreign trips since the pandemic. He didn't travel to the UN General Assembly. That was addressed via video message. Nor did he even travel to the opening of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity in China, in southwest China, in Kunming, where he addressed it virtually. So I don't think it signals anything with regard to Xi Jinping's own commitment to climate change, given that he's been making unilateral, pretty large-scale statements at the UN on climate change in the last few weeks. So I don't think there's any question that China is still in COP26, as it were. In terms of who is going, Xie Jianhua, the lead negotiator at Glasgow for China, is one of the architects of the Paris Treaty, effectively. He is a really important figure in China's climate diplomacy and has a very long-standing, deep working relationship with his US counterpart, John Kerry. It's one of the more optimistic kind of signs we can look to if we want to see kind of a reemergence of some coordination or cordiality or even cooperation between the US and China. That's kind of one of the most likely avenues that it would work through, is that existing sort of opportunity. I just think more broadly as well, we need to just bear in mind that China's commitment to climate action is not really predicated on its international cooperation with the UN. It's really driven by national policy efforts and by national self-interest. China has made very clear over the past decade or so that moving towards a low carbon economy is a major part of its industrial policy. It sees itself as a leading technological player, as a leading supplier of the low carbon technologies for a carbon constrained world. It's positioned its economy to benefit from that. And it's actually made this a big part of the sort of economic reform program that it's playing out, just to say moving up the value chain away from low cost, energy intensive, polluting manufacturing towards innovation and services, moving towards slower, higher quality growth. A lot of that is really entwined with climate action in a way that's, shows that climate action for China isn't really about international pressure. It's not altruistic either. It's very much about where technology and economics are heading. And I think they're making a long-term bet on a carbon-constrained future, and I think they're right to.
Right, Dr. Pai, I mean, there's this sentiment, the larger geopolitical sentiment, which Matara is expressing, that China will not follow on its climate pledges. It's foolish to trust China, especially since it doesn't follow any international rules and does not cooperate with the WHO COVID-19 investigations. This is, of course, a larger kind of one question there in terms of trust of China. But taking up from what Dr. Geall was saying, how do you see China approaching the issue?
I mean, I think, look, it's hard to say what's going to happen at COP.
Sure.
But it is very much driven by national policies, right? Like it is, businesses in solar and wind provides a huge opportunity for local economic development, for creating millions of new jobs. And China is currently the leader in solar and wind space, right? The manufacturing of PV components and critical minerals and various other technologies. So China really sees this as an opportunity. But I just want to caution that while China will, go big on clean energy deployment and, raising its ambitions, coal is also deeply embedded in China, right, in provinces. And while, at the national level, from the federal government, there's obviously push towards more greener economy. The provinces who are deeply embedded in the coal economy or fossil fuel economy will push back. And you see that more and more power plants are being constructed, coal-fired power plants, and some of them are coming from the provinces because of the political economy, because of the jobs, the local revenues, and so on. So while to some degree China will push for clean energy technologies, it is not going to happen overnight. The pushback will come from provinces. There will be delays and so on. But on the whole, China is going in the right direction. The speed and the scale of that direction one can question, but the direction is clear.
So again, Dr. Pai, what about India on that yardstick in terms of speed and direction? Because again, a lot of your work, I think, from your PhD or probably even before that onwards, it's not just about external climate justice. I mean, you were talking about internal dynamics that also need to be addressed when you're transitioning from coal in terms of, say, employment for those people who are involved in that industry, right, Dr. Pai?
Yeah, for sure. So we have to make a distinction between China and India. India is a country whose energy demand is going to explode. If you look at any study, like including the IEA study, India's energy demand is going to be 3 times of what it is today. India is a very energy poor country. So from an energy security point of view, India's stand is very clear. We want to build renewables. We want to be a leader in renewables, but we do want to continue to harness coal. Now, we can question whether that will happen, because finance is, not warming up to the idea of building new coal plants or coal mines, and there is less and less support for coal infrastructure. But from a government point of view, as they see that the energy demand is going to grow, they are betting on both coal and renewables, at least in the next coming decades. The other big question is the question of what happens to a few states, right? 6, 7 states that produce coal in India, where employment is basically, these are already poor states, and coal is a very major source of both employment, local revenues, jobs, and various other things. I mean, even Indian Railways, which derives 50% of its revenue from coal, will have to really consider a post coal future. So, tying back coal to the net zero targets, one of the reasons also why India will never sign on to, I mean, I don't want to say never, but is likely to not sign on to a net zero target, is because it has to then make a statement or do something about the coal sector, for which I think India is not ready. The government has clearly taken a stand, which is like, okay, we will, push for renewables, which is our grand ambition target, but we will also, we're not ready to give up on coal.
Right, Dr. Gill, I'm just going to look for a question. I'm not sure whether you're extremely familiar with the Indian dynamics, but let me see. The question is repeatedly being asked. Here it is. Soumya asks, could you throw light on ultra supercritical technology that countries, especially India, are investing in to cut CO2 emissions? And if you could elaborate on that.
I'm not a great expert on specifically on
Sure.
the sort of coal technologies and clean coal. I guess what I'll say, maybe to loop in that question and to sort of riff off what Dr. Pai was saying, is, China, like India, still sees clean coal as a big part of its transition pathway. And that's clear in the 14th Five-Year Plan, which came out in 2021, runs to 2025. And that's an issue. If you're looking at the long-term kind of carbon neutrality pathway that China's now set out, it aims to reach carbon neutrality in 2060 and to peak in 2030. But it still sees itself building out coal up until 2025. So there's going to have to be a real ramping down of emissions between 2025 and 2030 in a way that's actually going to be a very deep transition, very deep cut. That's actually quite hard to see how that works, especially without stranding a lot of new infrastructure. And the problem, of course, with building new coal plants is you lock in a particular technological pathway. A coal plant normally has a 40-year lifespan. So you're either committing to have expensive piece of infrastructure that is going to run idle or be highly underutilized, or you're essentially sort of creating a carbon bomb. So there is a tricky point here about actually how do we see the future of coal kind of as part of the transition or not. In China, for example, we might see a big ramping up of renewable infrastructure with coal kept on in some small way as a sort of peaking power, retrofitted for peaking power, which is not how coal is currently used, but in a more modern grid with reformed kind of energy markets and smarter grids and so on, is potentially sort of technologically possible. But all of this, it's complicated, and it points to the kind of bigger issue, which is the turning around the juggernaut of China's economy and a very complex and large energy system that is currently run in a very traditional way. If you want to transition that, you're really going to need to think about, I guess, the various sort of parts of getting to a just transition. And that means, as Dr. Pai pointed out, there's a push and pull between local and central, but there's also a kind of a push and pull between different factions, different elements of the economy, including kind of vested interests and so on. And then you also have the the unintended effects that come up when you try to move too fast. And that's one of the things that's now coming up, not only sort of in the conversations about a kind of just transition where you've got Rust Belt provinces and so on that are going to face mass unemployment, or potentially small coal mines that go out of business, leading to defaults, and then you could see local runs on banks. There's some very highly over-leveraged local governments, for example. There's a lot of potential effects that could play out. But also we've seen it very recently with a short-term energy crunch that's happened across a number of provinces. Yeah. There's been rolling blackouts, a number of power shortages. And that seems to be the kind of short-term effect of what happens if you decarbonize quite fast. Sometimes you get things like inflation, where there's a supply constraint on power, or an artificially suppressed power price. That means as coal price rises, plants just go out of business because they can't pass on the cost. So you get these sort of strange little effects that come up. As far as I'm concerned, it sort of points to the longer term trend, which is that the writing is on the wall for coal. I think we are going to see that thermal coal sort of structurally is in decline. But over the short term, there's this, there are these push and pull effects as they try to turn around the juggernaut.
Sure. Dr. Pai, if you want to take that, and also we played out a few reports and social media tweets and stuff when you're talking about India's hydrogen mission. You want to talk about that as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, just, India is really betting big on renewables and clean energy technologies. And a lot of this is coming from, the Prime Minister and their office. And there is a lot of push on like solar. We have a 450 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity target, which is humongous. It's not clear if we'll meet that target, but that's all right. Even if India doesn't meet that target, I think it's still a very strong push towards renewables. India has a hydrogen mission. It's leading in various other ways. It's talking about smart grids. But at the end of the day, to me, while that is all well and good and that is all useful, I don't think India is ready to give away its stand on coal yet. One of the big reasons being that India's coal fleet is very young. India's coal fleet was built in the last 2 decades. So the average age is 13 years compared to, let's say, an OECD average of 40 plus years. And much of the lending for these coal fleet has come from state-owned banks, so that if you suddenly, without a plan, you start to phase out some of these units, there'll be a huge problem in the banking crisis, and so on and so forth. So India's position going into COP is very, very clear. Talk big about renewables, but India is not ready to talk about a transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy. India will grow, and from an energy security point of view, from various other point of views, for India's position is to harness both renewables and coal.
Dr. Geall, I mean, we do a lot of foreign policy and strategic analysis, not just, we're not climate experts as say, but, if AUKUS was bad enough, I mean, and now you have something that we're expecting to be probably announced by the Prime Minister, also WOG, one sun, one world, one grid. Very ambitious, sounds good, but how realistic is it? 140 countries, I think, right?
Yeah, my impression is that sort of international supergrid kind of ideas are exciting. They are, they capture the imagination, but they don't have a good record of delivery. Actually, the idea, there are. That's not to say there aren't sort of grid interconnections and so on that exist across the European Union, for example, and these can be valuable, and I think that they're an important part of building out the sort of infrastructure we need for for a renewables-based economy. But the kind of really grand plans for global supergrids and so on haven't tended to be realized in the past. The most famous one in Europe is the so-called Desertec plan, which is this idea to essentially cover the Sahara in solar panels for transmitting the power to Europe. And I mean, there's lots of reasons why I think that was not a workable idea, but I don't think it was realistic. So I don't see the kind of supergrid things as necessarily that important. They might be important geopolitically in terms of certain signals that are being sent.
Dr. Pai, if you want to have the last word on that.
I mean, I think, it's an ambitious idea. It gives India a center stage. You can go and talk about larger missions which have international implications. I'm a little bit more pessimistic about such grand ideas, part because I don't think India has. I mean, I applaud the target and the idea, but I don't think India has the capacity, like, let's say, China. Like, China can go and do the Belt and Road Initiative. It has its own issues, agreed, but I don't think India has that kind of might to bring 140, 150 countries and build that supergrid. But it does give you a direction. It does show the intent. So that is something we can acknowledge.
Dr. Pai, I absolutely appreciate your experience and your expertise and your early timing that you're joining us there. Thank you so much. I'm just going to take a few more lighter noted comments or questions. Matara was saying, tell the West to switch off everything for the weekend to write their historical climate emissions. And PB also has, on a lighter note, maybe Elon Musk is working on charging battery farms using lightning. Anyway, on that, Dr. Pai, thanks so much again.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Dr. Geall, absolutely appreciate you appearing for the first time on Strat News. Hope to have you again soon, especially since COP is going to go on till almost middle of next month.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Pleasure is all ours. Thank you both again. And just a reminder to our viewers, what we notice in our analytics is that about more than 70% of our viewers who actually watch our videos are not subscribed. Now, that could mean that you're not logged on through your Google or Gmail IDs, but we're trying to get our subscriber base up. So do subscribe if you haven't, and do spread the word as well. Thank you for watching. This is StratNewsGlobal, and you've been watching Talking Point. I'm Amitabh.